Alright, so the mid-range gamer motherboard is the most competitive segment of the PC market. And with motherboards like the Asus TUF Gaming X570 Plus, which I reviewed not so long ago, you should check out, or even the ASROCK X570 Elite, companies like ASROCK might have wanted to go elsewhere. Instead, it decided to go all in and released its X570 Steel Legend. 1050 amps power stages, 4.6 GHz RAM support, and wait for it, Thunderbolt 3 support. Yes, on an AMD motherboard. It makes no sense. Makes no sense. I am going to try to keep it together during the review because even though this is not a perfect board, I am extremely excited about it. There's so much stuff to talk about. So, starting with the obvious, we are dealing with a 6-layered ATX PCB powered by an AM4 CPU socket supporting both second and third generation of Ryzen processors. VRM-wise, we have a very premium 1050 amps power stages configuration organized in a 4+2 phases. That's about 400 amps CPU-centric electrical yumminess to power even the most demanding, and when I say the most demanding, the highest core count Ryzen 3000 series CPU proposes, namely right now the 3900X, which I think has 12 cores. And that's plenty of electricity, so I have absolutely no worries about that. It is cooled by really thick and big heatsinks. I mean, they don't call it Steel Legend for nothing. They're so steely. Legendary steely, what? And they do an amazing job at keeping this VRM ice cold in any instance, and that's an immediate kudos to ASROCK for this. Memory-wise, we have the usual 2 channels configuration, which can support up to 128 GB of DDR4 RAM, clockable up to 3.6 GHz when coupled with a Ryzen 2000 series, and an unprecedented and rare 4.66 GHz if coupled with a Ryzen 3000 series CPU. That is quite simply the highest RAM clock I've seen on a motherboard at that budget, $200 mark. And that's a very good example of how a Ryzen 3000/X570 chipset combo will impact the overall performances of your build. Staying in the memory, our board can support up to 2 M.2 solid-state drive, which can transfer up to 32 gigabit per second when coupled with a Ryzen 2000 series CPU and therefore operating in PCIe 3rd generation. But coupled with the Ryzen 3000 series CPU, then our board will operate in a PCIe 4th generation standard, and our compatible M.2 solid-state drive will transfer data up to an unprecedented 64 gigabit per second. Of course, this does translate in a lot of heat, and that is precisely why ASROCK went all in on a gigantic and very thick, and I mean 2 full millimeter thick aluminum heatsink. And you know, given the fact that this heat shield is responsible to keep our M.2 solid-state drive and the X570 chipset as cool as possible, it makes sense to have it that big and that thick. But the problem I have with it is that the M.2 solid-state drives can go really hot. And the X570 chipset is notoriously also very hot, 11 watt hot. And of course, you do have a Delta turbine, which is an active cooling solution, which is here to keep that chipset as cool as possible. But I'm really afraid of having heat bleeding between components, having a transfer of heat throughout a single heat shield. So I would have preferred to see dedicated heat shields on every of the components. Export-wise, we're dealing with 5 PCIe slots, 3 single slot single speed and 2 16 slots with different speeds. Note that only the first and closest to the CPU can support up to 16 lane speeds, making it the best candidate for an optimal single GPU configuration. The second one has been capped at only 4 PCIe lanes and therefore not really the best option for a GPU, and that what I would have said if we were dealing with a PCIe 3rd generation motherboard. But when coupled with a Ryzen 3000 CPU, our PCIe operates in a 4th generation standard, effectively doubling its bandwidth to 2 GB per second per lane and per direction, and it can easily operate a 2080 Ti without bottlenecking. So my point here is that I would have loved to see a second metal reinforcement to allow a safe multi-GPU configuration. And storage-wise, we have 8 third-generation SATA blocks, which can all transfer data up to 6 gigabit per second individually. And as I said before, it has nothing to do with ASRock again, I am tired of seeing bottlenecked, infested SATA plugs on our boards. We're in 2019, it's been decades. Let's get a new standard, let's get something else fast. Back IO-wise, first let me note the presence of a flexible integrated IO shield, which is always a good idea for first-time builder and not always present at this price range. Now, starting from the left, we have 2 integrated display outputs, our keyboard, mouse, PS2 plugs, 4 5 gigabit 3.2 first generation USB plugs, 4 10 gigabit 3.2 second generation USB plugs, including a Type-C, our gigabit LAN, and finally our usual 8-channel Realtek audio codec. If you do want to upgrade the connectivity of your motherboard, you can do so through the M.2 Wi-Fi connector right here, which will deliver up to 1.7 gigabit per second. Nothing too surprising here, I'm just gonna regret the absence of a clear CMOS button, which given the configuration and the specs of this motherboard would be helpful in a troubleshooting situation. Onboard wise, we have 2 second generation USB plugs and 2 5 gigabit 3.2 first generation front panel connectors. But where I am truly excited is to find an extremely rare Thunderbolt 3 connectors. And when I say rare, I mean this is the first time that I see it on an AMD motherboard, and maybe is it even the very first time you see a Thunderbolt on an AMD motherboard, because this is an Intel proprietary technology. And given the X570 chipset gargantuesque bandwidth ability, it will be able not only to support Thunderbolt 3, but to give it unprecedented amount of bandwidth. And I'm so happy to see it. So that's an instant and a heavy and an absolute kudos to ASRock for this. Cooling wise, we have 6 PWM fans, one of which you can use with an all-in-one water pump. Obviously, this is not an enthusiast motherboard focused on custom water cooling, but that did not stop me from trying anyways. And would you look at that? Ain't that pretty? It's pretty. Troubleshooting wise, as in many X570 boards, we now have an easy debugger, the very minimum to effectively diagnostic a failed boot. And finally, this would not be a gamer motherboard without a bunch of RGB connectors on it, and polychrome RGB connector, may I add. The software, the proprietary ASRock software, which allows your motherboard's RGB strips to sync its lighting effect with other compatible components through your build. And so starting with 2 nested addressable RGB strips, one under our IO roof and one under our chipset heat shield. And if this was not enough, because it never really is enough, is it? We have 3 more RGB connectors, one of which is addressable. In conclusion, at about $200 before taxes, the ASRock X570 Steel Legend is, in my opinion, probably the biggest bang for your buck, the best dollar value computer motherboard you can get. And I'll start by the VRM. It's probably not the most powerful VRM I've seen at that price range, but definitely a VRM which can handle absolutely everything you can thread it, including a 3900X and an overclocked 3900X. But what I really liked about it is the fact that it really managed to keep super ice cool thanks to those massive aluminum rugged heatsinks, which are the star of it all. Secondly, the RAM is ridiculously performant. At 4.66 gigahertz at $200, there's nothing faster at that price range. And finally, the fact that we have, for the very first time on an AMD-powered motherboard, the Thunderbolt 3.0 technology, which redefines my bandwidth expectation of this particular motherboard. But it's not all pink. I have a couple of critics, and not the least. I'm not a fan of that big monumental thick heatsink, which is here for M.2 solid state drive and chipset. I think that there are too many components to cool even with such a big plate, and I'd like to see them separated on the next iteration of this board. But the fact remains that at $200, what ASROCK has delivered is a robust, performant, and very, very richly featured motherboard. In many aspects, it is dominating its natural competition by giving us so much more for our money than more mainstream or premium brands out there.